Good evening, and welcome to the UK Democracy Network's first AI and Democracy webinar of 2024. Thanks so much for joining us. This session is being recorded and will be made available to all Democracy Network members. So if you're watching this recording after the event has taken place, then a very warm welcome to you too. We'll be fielding questions as part of this webinar, but if you're watching this back at a later date and have any further questions, then please do feel free to get in touch and we'll do our best to answer them for you. My name is James Moulding, and I am the UK Democracy Network Development Lead. And for those that aren't familiar, the UK Democracy Network works to strengthen the relationships and connections between organisations, projects, and individuals working to build a healthier democracy in the UK, providing you with the resources, information, and collaboration opportunities to take your work to the next level. So, whether you're working to register voters ahead of the general election, or you're a local independent journalist working to highlight bad practices of your local council, we're here to help. We're a UK-wide network spanning Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and England, and membership is free and open to all working on or around issues of democracy, power, and voice in the UK. As I say, I believe this is our first AI on Democracy webinar of the new year of 2024, and we'll be running these regular webinars, providing you, the organisations, projects, campaigners, and practitioners of the democracy sector with the tools, concepts, and learning from experts within and outside of the democracy movement. So if you're interested in looking back through our archive of excellent speakers and topics around AI and democracy, you can check out our YouTube, which I'll post in the chat in a minute. In today's session, we'll be taking a deep dive into the world of AI and elections, exploring the impacts or not of large language models and other AI tools on the integrity and outcomes of democratic elections this mega year of elections across the globe. Guiding us through these important issues tonight is Sam Jeffers, co-founder of Who Targets Me. Who Targets Me are an incredible campaign, birthed in the heady days of the UK 2017 election. During that election, they launched and experimented with their first browser extension to monitor and catalogue political ads in real time on people's browser windows, taking note of the various ways in which political parties at that time were competing for attention on social media platforms. 7 years later, and 10 elections later, Who Targets Me are now active around the world with more than 50,000 people participating in over 100 countries, working together to crowdsource online political advertising and protect the integrity of elections. We're also joined tonight by the excellent Isabella Roberts, my co-host for the night. Isabella is the founder of ANTIPARTY, a pro-democracy movement looking to transcend the two-party system by applying collective intelligence for systems change. So in this session, Sam will unpack their work and learnings for approximately 40 to 45 minutes, take us into a deep dive exploring the impact of AI in elections and political advertising. After Sam's talk, we'll take a little bit of time for questions before finishing off probably around about 8 p.m. So if you've got any urgent clarifying questions throughout the session, do feel free to raise your hand or use the Zoom raise hand reaction in the bottom panel. If you'd like to hear more about future upcoming workshops and webinars, or to get involved in the AI and Democracy group or WhatsApp group, or to get involved in the wider Democracy Network itself, you can let us know directly or sign up in the check-in document that I've just posted in the chat. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over now to Sam. Thank you, Sam.
Okay.
And let me just
Yeah.
spotlight you.
Thanks, James. Very kind intro. Thanks for having me. I'm going to try and do this without any slides. Normally, people like to put slides up, and so the upside of that is I'm going to just try and talk about this subject, following some notes. The downside is I'm not going to talk for 45 minutes. That would be a lot, and I'm not here to deliver a university lecture. These are some thoughts I have on this topic. Yeah, I mean, as James says, I mean, we started Who Targets Me in 2017. Before that, I'd worked on the flip side of that. So I'd worked on sort of digital political campaigns for an agency called Blue State Digital, and I was much more of a kind of practitioner and trying to think about how to win elections on the internet and the sorts of ways that you could mobilize, fundraise, persuade people using the tools we had back then. So this is really before particularly the sort of social media advertising age got really going in 2014, 15. The last campaign I was really actively involved in was the Scottish referendum campaign of 2014, and then the Labour campaign of 2015. And I think there were a lot of lessons about the impact and role of social media that came out of both of those elections, let alone what then happened in 2016 with Brexit and Trump. So yeah, for the 7 years after, well, since 2017, we have been studying political ads and how they get used around the world. And I think the reason we do that is because we're very interested in what actually does happen on online and how campaigns think about winning elections. And we're interested in things that happen at scale, often with large amounts of money behind them, uh, things that have intention behind them, where they're the idea is, well, there's this audience we want to reach with this particular message, and we have this much resource that we're prepared to invest to make that happen. And so political ads for us are a really great way of trying to almost read campaigns from the inside out. And so that's what we try and do with the project. So as James said, we've built a browser extension where people can donate data. We've also built data sets which will track spending at scale, that will track the ways that the ads are being targeted and the types of messaging that's being used. And we'll talk about that a lot. I mean, we have pretty active social media channels, particularly on Twitter, but we also do quite a lot of media and that sort of stuff. And certainly this year, we're expecting to show up in quite a lot of media around the election, and have been doing bits of filming and talking to newspapers about and so on about how we're going to cover this topic, because we think it's going to be a pretty big topic this year, political ads. And again, I'll come on to AI in a second, but political ads are definitely something which the parties are going to invest a lot of money in, which candidates are going to invest a lot of money in, and will be the largest single spending item for the political parties in this campaign. So again, while topics kind of move on to AI, or is this going to be a TikTok election, or these sorts of questions, they will still also be routinely a Facebook ads, Instagram ads, and YouTube ads election as well. And we shouldn't lose sight of that, because that is stuff that is happening and that we can track. So moving on to the actual topic at hand, after the long-winded intro, AI. So as James said, lots of elections this year. 2 billion plus people voting, and we're not going to see this kind of lineup of elections again, I think, for another 25 years, I think, until the cycles line up again. So it's a very big year for elections, and I think what we're seeing is, me there just having talked about the kind of current impact of technology and the ways that campaigns use technology. We're sort of talking, quite speculatively about a new technology and its potential impact, on elections. Silicon Valley, the political system. There's quite a lot of ongoing existential tech-driven panic about the rise of AI and its effects on our democratic and political and social systems. Sam Altman, who runs OpenAI, says he thinks that AI will be capable of superhuman persuasion well before it is superhuman at general intelligence, which may lead to some very straight outcomes. So there's quite a hype-filled statement there. That it will be able to persuade us of all sorts of things quite soon. So this kind of idea that AI hype is around every corner and in all of these conversations. And obviously things like ChatGPT have raised a lot of concerns about the future of work. They kind of hold the mirror up to our own usefulness. A lot of the things we do all day, they do kind of let us see what a world might look like if humanity was not at the top of the kind of intelligence pyramid anymore. But, there's also a lot about how quickly this will be ushered in, how it will solve these problems. It will create a world of abundance. It will fix healthcare, fix climate change, deliver clean energy, solve agriculture, food, etc., etc. So there's a lot of this sort of hype. There's also this kind of negative direction, right, where AI overtakes us. Particularly, this is kind of quite existential conversation. It overtakes us, decides it no longer needs us. And so there's all these people working on what they call alignment, with human values and needs, and this kind of existential threat. We've been through a lot with AI already, right? It already has a long history, and it's gone through several periods where people have great optimism for what's possible before it disappears again. We're really in an AI summer at the moment. Lots of excitement, lots of investment, a lot of people trying to make money from it as quickly as possible, to try and fit with this sort of venture capital investment cycle. There's been many periods over the last 60 years or so where those advances disappear, and the thing that we thought we knew turned out not to be as helpful and profitable as we expected, and another AI winter arrives, and so on. And it's not inconceivable that in some senses that might be happening again already. So for all the talk of ChatGPT being the fastest consumer product to having 100 million users in history, it's a very expensive product. It costs millions and millions of dollars every day to run. It doesn't really make any money at this point. No one has really worked out, deep use cases for it. There's a little bit of early evidence that there's sort of user base has plateaued already, and that people are sort of no longer logging in as much as they were and not using it as much in their day-to-day stuff. So there is this possibility that that winter is actually already begun, if not a sort of flattening out. But I think the reality is there's one picture that's very rosy for the future of AI, and there's one picture that's quite negative for the future of AI, and the likeliest path, as with all things, is probably somewhere down the middle of those two things. So we don't know a lot so far, but I think if we try and think about what we do know and try and put these kind of advances or new things in some sort of context, I think we can have a look at how we can think about certainly countering the potential threats of AI to democracy, and investing in the health of democracies in the short term. And we can do that regardless, right? Whether AI turns out to be a huge thing or whether AI doesn't turn out to be a huge thing, just good investment in democracy, transparency, all of these sorts of things are just helpful things to do in general. So we should do these things anyway. And I think part of that is because the democratic era we're in isn't great. Populism has led a bit of a charge against democratic institutions. I don't think Britain has been the worst place that has happened, but it has happened. People are obviously challenging the legitimacy of the press, the idea of facts, how voting systems work. There's a real loss of collective faith in politicians to do the things that they say they'll do, but also just to stay within the norms and boundaries of kind of political behavior that are definitely causing some issues. And so, not just in the UK, but lots of places, you see this idea of kind of democratic backsliding taking place.
Are you watching your thing?
Hello. So Who Targets Me has been working on transparency about the role of tech and in elections and campaigns for the last 7 years, and working on those campaigns, as I said before that. We've worked through at least 2 hype cycles just in that period alone, right? So first period, which is the one where I was sort of doing campaigning work, was that optimistic side, right, where social media seemed like it might connect the world together. It could elect the first black president in the United States. It could topple regimes in the Middle East. It could do these incredible, powerful things. And then post 2016, the kind of backlash effect. So that where all that good turned into uncertainty and doubt about the role of the internet in healthy societies, and that really continues to this day, both at the sort of level of sort of personal mental health and your engagement with social media, but also the wider sort of social health as a result of how much time we all spend online and how much we kind of spend how much time we spend scrolling. And so what we I think have seen, or what I've certainly seen over the now 15-16 years I've been working in this particular space, is we just learned a lot about how campaigns work online and how the public and the media responds to what they're doing. We watch how people adopt new technologies to persuade voters. We've gone through the cycles of the different technologies that have been part of that. Firstly, the web, then email, then social media, ads. Now, where people are talking about vertical video and AI and these sorts of things. And so they keep adding more as they do this. The campaigns are adding more and more data into the mix. They're always trying to find a new edge over their opponents and find more and more sophisticated ways of reaching the voters they want. So I guess the question is how does AI compound and accelerate this trend? Is it worth how does AI compound and accelerate this trend? Should we worry about that? And I think the thing I want to try and do here now for the rest of the talk is to kind of point about the things that can get in the way of generative AI actually being a threat to democracy. The point I'm going to almost start with 10 minutes in, is to say I don't think AI is actually going to cause very much harm to democracy in 2024. Not really. There will be things that will happen. There will be incidents. I think in the grand scheme of things, in 2024, they will be ultimately fairly meaningless in the UK. I'm going to try and go through some of those reasons and make the argument. So the first thing is I don't think campaigns are going to use generative AI very much, certainly in a kind of harmful way. Using synthetic images, video, text, it's going to open them up to big questions about their authenticity, right? So, people have done scientific experiments on whether or not they trust AI-generated content. They label it, they test it against content without a label, and people are massively distrustful of AI-generated content. A huge problem there. So, for me, I think sensible political campaigns won't want that distrust to rub off on them for the sake of, whatever they think it is, a joke, saving some money on content creation, a quick political hit. I don't think that's worth the effort for them. I think they will get into a fair amount of trouble in the media. I think they'll get into a fair amount of trouble from their opponents. I think it will cost them time and money as they have to explain why they're doing it. So I think some potentially shameless campaigns will go ahead, but I think the problem there is their shamelessness rather than the actual use of tools they choose to go ahead with. I think the second thing that people seem to worry about is this idea of like these perfect sort of technologically powered campaigns where Cambridge Analytica style, they sit on top of a huge data store, they deliver these kind of individually crafted AI messages at exactly the right moment in a kind of multi-channel, perfectly timed, perfect message, perfect moment type of way. That's a very long way off if it ever happens at all, right? So way back in 2008, 2012, people talked about how the Obama campaign was a perfect internet campaign with all these wonderful email messages and this supporter engagement and all the rest of it. But the reality is that this was a fairly basic email driven campaign in lots of ways. Quite a lot of segmentation. There was some quite very good copywriting and all the rest of it. But in terms of kind of this perfect message, perfect moment, etc., there would have been gaps all over the place. And if you look around, no campaign has been able to successfully replicate that model since. There's just too much going on. If you take the Biden campaign, right? So the Biden campaign running now is probably going to be the richest political campaign in history. Probably spending north of $1.5 billion, maybe even $2 billion on the re-election campaign. They can notionally do anything with that amount of money, but the idea that they'll be able to create even this kind of perfect, data-driven message, money, moment type thing, I think is really unrealistic. It's highly unlikely, and I just don't think any other campaign in other parts of the world will be able to come close to that, right? In terms of that sort of perfect marketing machine. And so what you then look at, if you're not if I'm not expecting to see much in terms of sort of ongoing generative AI use from campaigns in terms of their content creation or their sort of messaging and targeting, then you start to look into the things that are a bit more kind of like, well, everything else looks a bit more isolated and minimally effective, right? So, the kind of most famous examples so far in and around elections are things like the deepfake videos that ran in the Slovakian election, a deepfake of President Zelensky in Ukraine saying that he was surrendering. You've had some audio deepfakes of Keir Starmer sort of swearing at aides. One today of the House of Commons Speaker swearing at aides. One of Sadiq Khan sort of again swearing about how he wanted the pro-Palestine march to go ahead on Remembrance Sunday last year, which allegedly inflamed tensions, although tensions were already quite inflamed, and I'm not sure whether how much difference you would attribute to that deepfake happening. Last year there was quite an interesting example where someone posted an AI generated video of a bomb blowing up the Pentagon, and the American financial markets dipped for a few minutes, and then the images spread on Twitter, etc. Someone looked out the window, saw that the Pentagon was not on fire, and the markets returned to normal very quickly thereafter. So you have these kind of things where these kind of instantaneous, oh my God, what do I know sort of things, but they're pretty quickly debunked. They don't actually get that much traction. They tend not to end up being written up in the media. They're relatively small scale things in the grand context of elections and these sorts of things. And then if you look at some places where you think, well, AI generated disinformation could be a big issue, like the Israel-Palestine conflict. The reality is we've seen very little use of generative AI around that particular conflict, right? Partisans on both sides much prefer to use real things that are actually happening. There's no real need to kind of exaggerate what's going on. There's no real need to create fake stuff. And if you do want to, you can take pictures from Syria or elsewhere in previous wars and so on and rebadge them as something else. And it's much, much cheaper and much, much more straightforward to do that than to have to create any kind of AI deepfakes, propaganda, etc., to spread that message. So, I think a lot of the examples that get used so far feel very isolated, and I don't think they feel very existential for elections in that sense. And so that piecemeal thing, I think, is a real issue, right? So, for this stuff to be a real problem, it has to kind of add up to something. It kind of has to hitch itself to a wider narrative and get carried along. Without that idea of like a narrative and some virality, it won't work. So, over the last few years in the US, in the right there, we've seen them create these kind of narratives, right? They haven't used AI to do it, but Pizzagate, QAnon, MAGA, these are these kind of, narratives of the right that allow them to create a particular world to live in and so on. Those stories went a long way, right? They dragged hundreds, maybe thousands of people into the Senate chamber to try and overthrow the American government on one occasion, right? This is a serious thing. But we should also remember that those things, they weren't real. And MAGA protesters ended up in jail. They ended up paying, their supporters ended up paying lots of money in legal suits. They weren't real. The system caught up with them, and so on. And as it stands, I don't think generative AI, none of the tools are creative or autonomous enough to come up with one of these sorts of movements. You still need people to invent them and to carry them and to do all of the sort of skillful human things that people do. They have knowledge across politics, they have knowledge across news, they know how to distribute stories, they know how to fit them into narratives that might affect democratic outcomes and so on. They'll work over time with the clear sense of what stories they're trying to tell, the notes they're trying to hit. They'll be witty, they'll be funny, they'll be creative, they'll be challenging, there'll be all of those sorts of things. So there's no sort of sense that like AI as a kind of overarching topic has the ability to do any of this stuff right now. And if you actually stop for a second and think like, how am I going to do this, right? I am a bad actor with an idea about how I want to cause havoc. It's actually really, really hard, right? You've got, if you want to cause things that are damaging to politicians or politics in some sort of way, you have to sit there and you have to think about, well, what the storylines I need to create, what are the ways in which generative AI might help me, right? You've got your classic topics, you've got money, you've got sex, you've got abuse of power, corruption, speaking off record, all of these sorts of things. But the reality about the political downfalls that come with most of these things is that they happen because they're real, right? There's enough scandal in politics that's real to have to, without necessarily having to say we should create this from scratch, and that this, that by doing this sort of fake thing, we'll be able to somehow influence the stuff. Creating pictures of ballot stuffing or leaking a bunch of emails or these sorts of things. That is, I think, just unlikely to create much momentum in itself. So yeah, fakes can, I think, create this momentary reality, but real reality is much more of a real problem. So yeah, I think people are much less persuadable than you think. And I think a lot of this comes down to, like, if you read the media coverage of this, and this is what I'm sort of trying to use this talk to sort of push back a bit against, is like, I think a lot of the way that people kind of try and explain deepfakes in elections is if like the baddies, that bit in superhero movies where baddies just turn on all the TVs to the same channel and just show themselves doing a bad thing, and everyone is stood outside the TV shop looking at the window and sort of, jaw drops at this sort of the Joker kind of talking back at you. I feel like this is the sort of model that people seem to have about deepfakes, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the real way in which people are, reached with messages and persuaded and all of these sorts of things. It's just not really the way things happen. And I think one of the reasons, again, for that happening is that we just live in this world of massive media fragmentation, right? The mass media is much less powerful than it was. We don't all read the same newspaper in the morning. We don't all look at the same news program in the evening. We don't listen to the same radio programs. Everything is fragmenting. The big social media platforms are fragmenting into smaller ones. The biggest, radio personalities are actually now independent podcasters. Film and TV shows are spread across all these streaming channels. We don't watch much live TV anyway anymore. Information is spreading across closed messaging apps. And so this idea of like scaling a plausible narrative where AI has this kind of big, kind of catastrophic master effect just feels like, again, impossible, right? No one has this mastery of the modern media environment where you can work across the fragmented ecosystem, get traction on all the platforms at once, right? Every platform has its own algorithm, every platform has its own moderation system, their own rules, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, we work a lot on targeted advertising. If you actually look at your ads most of the time, they hardly know you at all, right? And these are people who, again, doing things with a great amount of intention and resource and planning and all the rest of it. We're just not seeing that in generative AI, right? People are making things, the odd thing has a little hit and then it evaporates again a day later. So, if you think about how, if you're going to try and create generative AI, that you're going to create this sort of democratic weapon, it has to pass through the eye of so many needles, the systems, moderation systems of platforms, the journalists who look at stuff, the fact checkers who work on those platforms, most of this content is going to get stuck somewhere in a kind of unrecommended backwater. Someone's going to phone up to try and verify it. It'll never answer the phone call. No one will be able to confront it. And so, apart from maybe Twitter, which has lost all of its ability to moderate or do sensible things, most of the other platforms are going to try and prevent these sorts of things happening. They're not, they may be less good at it than they were a few years ago, but they're not totally useless at all. And again, you look at what they're actually trying to do. Again, you may not believe what platforms say they're up to, but last weekend in Munich at the big security conference there, they all signed an accord to protect elections this year. Those elections protections will be far from perfect, but they will, each of them, do various things to break the chains of bad communication happening as much as possible. And they have enormous incentives to do so, right? If the quality of your time on Twitter is, you're spending your whole time flooded with obviously fake content, then the value of that network falls to zero. Same would happen if your WhatsApp groups were flooded with, deep fakes and AI the whole time. You would be pretty unhappy about it, and you might think, I'm not going to spend any time there anymore. So they have enormous incentives to try and keep these places as real as possible. And I do think they've all learned a little bit, at least, from the election challenges over the last few years. I mean, that's why they're all running up front about what's going to happen with these services in 2024. Now trying to make as many commitments as possible and so on. I think they're setting the bar. I think, frankly, they're setting the bar quite high, so that at the end of 2024 it's much easier for them to say we were successful and self-regulation is a system that will work for us, and it will buy them some time to kind of keep going. So to finish up, I just want to talk about the last couple of challenges, and these ones are more kind of legal. So one of these obviously is data protection, right? So one of the concerns people have is that lots of voter data is going to get sort of scraped off the internet, or thrown into AI models and used in all sorts of ways. I read a report about an AI research group that had managed to kind of de-anonymize lots of Reddit users from their usernames and some of their posting histories and so on, and had kind of tried to create political profiles of all of those people. Now, obviously, like that data, all that data on the internet is very tempting for people who want to do this in unethical ways, but it is in the UK and Europe, in many other places, just literally illegal. And if your campaign or whoever you are decides to do this, and you get caught, ripping off data from places, profiling voters with AI, I think it's going to be pretty scandalous. I think it's going to be pretty embarrassing. It's going to be pretty costly. The Information Commissioner is going to be quite interested in what you're up to. In Europe, the equivalent authorities are going to have a go at you as well. So I think there are some real data protection issues around uses of AI for targeting. I think people have a lot of questions if that starts to happen at all. Obviously, there's a copyright challenge, right? Generative AIs are, I think they're half alive and half dead, frankly, with some of the copyright challenges they face. They have scraped all sorts of copyrighted materials from all over the place, and tried to claim that the outputs of the things they have created are somehow original or unique in the same way that maybe it is after we've read a book or something like this. I think they've stolen trillions of words, billions of images, and legal cases will abound for a long time to see whether or not that stuff is a legitimate business model. And I think the other legal risk is one just literally of what you'd call something like fraudulent impersonation, right? The moment you start creating Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer deepfakes, you are poking the hornet's nest of people who are trying to stop that happening straight away, right? I would imagine we would be not very far from emergency legislation that says doing this is illegal, and that people will be followed by police until they are found and so on. I listened to a podcast from the BBC's Mariana Spring over the weekend talking about, she was investigating a Sadiq Khan deepfake audio thing. She tracked it down to a TikTok account, and she'd sort of saw that the owner of that account had kind of basically professed relief when the police had said, oh no, we're actually not going to investigate this any further. They kind of posted this sort of sweaty crying emoji to sort of say, oh my God, I didn't even think that I was going to be someone who might get arrested for creating some what I thought was sort of satirical or fun content or whatever on the internet. The more widespread this becomes and the more these kind of examples pop up, the more likely it is, frankly, I think, that the hammer will come down on this sort of behavior, and we'll probably put a stop to it fairly quickly. So those are the reasons I personally think that there are a lot of barriers in the way of generative AI causing serious harm this year. So I don't think mainstream campaigns are going to get into using it very much. I think that sort of technical fear of like this kind of hyper-personalized, super targeted campaigning, I think is still a way off in this space. I don't think AI can run a narrative. I think it can create a moment, but it can't run a narrative. the media system is massively fragmented, so just getting those narratives to hop from place to place to place and take hold without them somehow, having the chains broken between these things, I think it's pretty likely that fragmentation is going to cause them big problems. And then there's a bunch of legal risk that I think is going to kind of gradually unfold over time. So, should we do anything about it? Yeah, of course, I think we should do some stuff about it. I think we should, invest in transparency. We should get the AI platforms and so on to think about content provenance and watermarking and, helping each other identify stuff. I think we should think really carefully about particular audiences who I think maybe are more vulnerable to this sort of stuff. I think they're vulnerable because they're more likely to be targeted, not because they're particularly, susceptible or anything like this. But I think, for example, again, with the kind of Israel-Palestine stuff going on, I think British Muslims potentially risk, being targeted by more kind of generative AI and disinformation content than other groups. I think the British left often, particularly the sort of left of Corbyn, Corbynite left rather, again, like have a particular narrative that they're looking to pursue around Keir Starmer and what's happening with the Labour Party. I think the sort of reform curious right, there's some susceptibility there to kind of immigration narratives and things like that. I also think individual politicians are probably quite susceptible as well. I think targeting them, on Twitter and so on, and either harassing or producing bits of content or potentially even sort of slightly sort of blackmail-y type content and so on, will be a problem at that sort of level. But again, I'm not prepared quite to say that I think these things are going to be necessarily existential. And I think that's, it's very hard to argue anything's existential in a polling environment where the Labour Party is 26 points ahead in the polls. It's not easy to imagine that much is going to affect the outcome of the British election under current circumstances. So I'll probably just leave it there because I've said quite a lot and probably spoken a lot more than I expected to. But yeah, I saw there were some things popping up, but I decided to keep going, and I'll have a look back now and see if there are any questions that I can answer.
Thanks so much, Sam. Thanks so much for sharing all your insights and views on this. I mean, paints a very optimistic future, a very hopeful future, and I would love to believe you. I know that could be a challenge in the sense of, are we going to put our head in the sand? Ignorance is bliss. But yes, there's definitely a lot of comments and questions in the chat. So I will start reeling these off. We've got a few from Richard, for example. Would you say there are any technological, societal, or political angles or events that would have to happen for your sense of threat to be heightened in any way? And sort of following from that, your case around why fragmentation is a defense against generative AI. Is it not more complex than simply reducing the threat there?
I think what I'm trying to respond to is what you read as the sort of what you call this kind of primary media narrative about AI and elections, right? Where people write 1,000 words in an op-ed about how democracy is going to die in 2024. And I think this is hype and wrong. That's the thing I'm trying to respond to here. I mean, obviously, there are individual pieces of this that will frighten us or make us feel like something is going on that we don't understand or can't ever get control of. I think there are, obviously, as I said, there are like groups of people in the UK and everywhere who are particularly going to be targeted by certain types of material and campaigns and so on. And it's vitally important that we try and work out how to rebut and protect and do all those sorts of other pieces of work, right? Because that, their votes are as important as anyone else's. But the this idea that this is going to swing elections, like there's some sort of thing that can just swing elections, like there's a great big dial that someone's going to just turn and everything's going to spin around. I think there is a sort of conspiratorial thing that has sprung up about the role of technology in democracy, which sometimes just overstates its impact, right? Like campaigns can make a difference, but they can't make that much of a difference. Like fundamentals are much, much more important. And we're talking about the UK here at the moment, and the fundamentals are very, very much in one particular direction. And I think if you were saying it's a 50-50 election, this is the Brexit referendum, there's something going on here, you would be a lot more concerned about it. But Britain particularly has, just by virtue of the fact that it is going to kick its government out very hard later this year, has a bit of time to think about this and actually stay quite calm about it, I think, in lots of ways. So, I think the circumstances are in our favor. Like, I do not think that's necessarily the case in places that are very broken, like the United States, where the election is a coin toss, and there is a baddie. One of the candidates is a genuine, historically bad person with zero ethics and all the rest of it, right? Like, that is something to worry about. It's just very difficult to say that's our problem. Hopefully Americans can sort that one out.
Interesting. So yeah, lots of very strong statements there, but I'm seeing a lot of nods in the room. So no, very, very interesting viewpoints. Thanks so much for raising that. And thanks so much everyone for your attention so far. Please keep putting your comments and questions in the chat. There's a real discussion driving up here. There's also a link to a sort of forum that will allow sort of specific conversations for each of these talks and topics following on from this event. So, after the event, we're not all just going to go away, and because there's so much more to say here. And on the optimism, point, there's just a comment here from David, just saying that, we're talking about, is AI in elections all hype? And actually there is a possibility where it can be used to help, say, candidates who are dyslexic and, they're using ChatGPT to turn what she writes into coherent sentences, which is great for campaigning and writing press releases, etc. So that's one way it can be used as a helpful tool. I know we've spoken about deepfake.
So we're planning in the next couple of months to start using some of these large language models to just help read ads better, right? Like, there are so many ads, it's hard to know what they're all saying at once. And the idea is that we can use this to sort of extract narratives and themes, and you can say, okay, look, here are the campaigning themes of this party, or here's the sorts of messages that are getting used in marginal constituencies and so on. So, I'm actually slightly optimistic that we will find some ways to use this to improve accountability and understanding of what's going on as well.
Good to hear. Ollie, you raised your hand. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks very much. Really great talk, Sam. Thank you. We from Future Advocacy, we made some deep fakes of Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn in 2019, which sort of broke the internet, and we did that to try and draw attention to the potential risks. And I think I'll put them in the chat. But I think, like, at that point, we thought that this would become much more ubiquitous, and I think though they cost about £14,000 to make, which is quite a lot. It's quite a lot of money. But there are plenty of people that have that amount of money who want to influence the political, democracy in the UK. So quite surprised that more hasn't happened. And I think there's that classic thing that we tend to overestimate the impact of technology in the short term and underestimate in the long term, and just get it wrong in the long term. So I think, because we base our estimations on what's technologically possible, and so you overestimate what's achievable in the short term because there's all sorts of other human stuff that stops that happening. But in the long term, I think things trend towards what's technologically possible. So I think there's still a chance that these things will be impactful, particularly because you only have to sway a tiny proportion of certain seats potentially to have that impact. But I more widely, I think certainly in our campaign work, our advocacy work, we're beginning to use generative AI models quite a bit in terms of developing advocacy strategies, developing written content, developing video content, and it's really like a power enhancer. I think has to be used pretty carefully, and there are lots of risks and ethical issues. But I think these technologies will transform the way every aspect of work is done over the next decade, and I think campaigning and politics and advocacy will be the same. We might not know quite how now, but I think they'll be very impactful.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that to some extent. I think what I suppose, we're quite responsible users of this stuff, right? And you're sort of using it in that sense for kind of productivity gains, and like I find these tools can be quite useful for, like, give me 10 ideas for this thing, and write me a short summary of this, and those sorts of things that are definitely, you might spend an hour looking at a blank page and you get some ideas down out there that you think this is a start and all the rest of it. So that, that has some potential value to it. But it doesn't seem to me that there's sort of, there's great value in people doing, actively trying to if you think, well, how do you want to destroy British democracy over the next 10 years, right? My version of that, with 50 million quid in my pocket or something, is probably to find a way to get it all to Reform and Nigel Farage. Like that is a much more straightforward thing than saying I'm going to run endless AI powered disinformation campaigns and all the rest of it. Let's just get it in the hands of the sort of least reputable actor who with some kind of visibility in British politics. So if I'm a Russia or whatever and I want to, I've had enough of Britain, funneling money through whatever mechanism I can is probably the best answer to that. So I think it's just worth always stepping back and saying, well, what is the most likely realistic scenario? I think the point about Richard makes in the chat about the rotting of public spaces, I think is a real issue, right? Like if we flood the zone with crap, but yet somehow we're still plugged into those zones and we still believe half of what we see or something, that's going to be a massive issue. I do think if those public spaces can't find a way to keep themselves mostly truthful and mostly realistic, then a lot of us will just move away from them. I think there are plausible scenarios that say we'll kind of revert back to much more trusted sources of truth, and we'll go direct to our news websites, and we'll go to places that we think actually produce things that are real about the world rather than things that are fake about the world. And so I think there's a kind of just a volume question, right? Like if you find eventually you find yourself in a place where you can't believe what you see anymore, you'll most rational people will leave the space, I think. So that sort of stuff is what I think is quite protective. Sorry?
No, so that's an interesting, I mean, that's key, isn't it? If we can't believe what we see anymore. So, and to your point around when we were raising the previous examples, when you're saying, Keir Starmer's voice note, screaming at an aide, etc., and obviously it was labeled as a deep fake. But what if people start to actually doubt that that's a deep fake and take that as real, even though it's been labeled as one? So, yeah, there's layers upon layers of sort of conspiracy and truth, essentially. Laurie's got a few questions here as well. Similarly, so Sam, are you saying that no one can use AI to disrupt using these fakes, and which causes real actual action? And following on from that, when you mentioned about regulation, self-regulation, regulation doesn't appear, or self-regulation even, doesn't seem to be working well in other sectors. And as you know, quite a lot of legislation and regulation is kind of post-event. After the financial crisis, you get all these regulatory bodies put in place. So can we afford to do sort of posthumous regulation after such a crisis? So yeah, why would we expect in the election political democratic space for self-regulation and regulation to work better here?
Yeah, look, I mean, the political ad space that we've worked in for a long time still has no new regulation in the UK to speak of. There's a tiny little imprints law, which doesn't really fundamentally change very much, and so on. And I think some of the way that people are sort of maybe less worried about it now is because the platforms have actually taken some kind of policy measures against the ways that people used to run certain types of political ads, and there's been new data protection legislation and all sorts of things have gradually come in and kind of changed that market a bit. I think you'll see defenses being put up probably after the fact, but to like individual instance as they happen, right? You'll see a big fake somewhere and people will freak out about it a bit, and there will be fairly quickly a rule thereafter, right? If you look in the US recently, so people ran some Joe Biden deep fake phone calls. People got these kind of robocalls from Joe Biden. About a week later, the Federal Elections Commission or Trade Commission or someone basically clarified the rule that says this stuff is actually illegal, right? You can't use impersonations of people's voices to reach voters, and are kind of investigating what's going on. So, I don't think it's necessarily the case that like self-regulation is a sort of permanent situation. I do think probably in the end the first thing that will happen, just because it takes to politicians can't necessarily predict what the outcomes of these things are going to be, and whether they're good or bad, and whether you're kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater with your legislation, particularly when they all see AI as this kind of economic gold mine. Someone, everyone's very happy to be like, well, it's going to transform the economy, but of course some terrible things will happen in the meantime, right? But they still hold on to this idea that it's going to transform the economy as their primary thing, and they don't want to try and harm anything. So you'll get these kind of big meetings where people sign lots of stuff, and there will be accords, and there will be Bletchley Park meetings and all the rest of it. But as individual bad things happen, there will be bits of regulation probably that follow it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's all hope it happens in good time. So yeah, if we have any more questions, comments, please put them in the chat. I have a question for you, Sam, which I think you've been posed it before, but wanted to raise it here again for the group, that there's this data protection and digital information bill going through Parliament right now. It's actually in the House of Lords at the committee stage. So no matter what people say about the House of Lords, I mean, there is some checking function there that is working. Stumbled across this, right? And there is a amendment clause going through, and we mentioned data protection earlier. And it actually talks about processing personal data revealing political opinions specifically. So having mentioned data protection, having mentioned, oh, maybe things won't be as bad as 2016 when we had the Trump election and when we had the Brexit referendum, and obviously we had the likes of Cambridge Analytica. So right now in the UK, there's this bill going through amending and allowing for processing of personal data revealing political opinions, specifically for, and this is the paragraph being inserted, for democratic engagement. And the processing can be carried out by an elected representative or a person acting with authority of such representative, and is necessary for the purpose of discharging the elected representative's functions. And the processing can be carried out by a registered political party or a candidate for election. So not elect, so it can be carried out by an elected representative, a registered political party, or a candidate for election. So, and that in parallel with the spending limit increase of 80%.
Yeah.
Do you see that as a risk at all and a perfect storm for another Cambridge Analytica?
I mean, again, like perfect storm is, so this change is it depends who you listen to, right? So some people say this just clarifies for politicians the fact that they should be allowed to campaign and sort of do democratic engagement. Other people say, okay, this opens up again, like the ability for people to buy and sell political data and do all sorts of things with it, and so on. I think there is, quite a lot of new stuff about to happen in the UK election, right? The spending laws have changed. It's a big difference. There is some new technology out there that will get used, and as you say, there's some data protection rule changes. It's just interesting. I think it's just going to have to be a watch and see. I'm obviously my view on it is that the government is trying to stack election rules at least as best they can in their favor for the forthcoming election. Again, I reiterate the fact that they're 26 points behind in the polls, and the chances of them clawing that back through campaign technique, I think, are pretty slim, right? There's a lot more to it than that. So, perfect storm maybe, but the storm is going to be happening in the, maybe the storm takes it from 26 to 23 points. I mean, that's the margin of impact of political campaigning like this, I think. And again, both sides will have it. The Labour Party will have plenty of money as well. I think it probably harms mostly the smaller parties who are going to struggle to raise money and don't have the kind of capacity to do that sort of data processing and all the rest of it. So it kind of makes the playing field uneven, but I don't think it makes it completely. It doesn't completely sort of slant it in the Tories' favour at all, based on where we are. So relevant authorities, etc., ICO particularly, will need to keep an eye out for flagrant misuse of this. And one of the things I kind of hope is that whoever the next government is, well, they come to it recognizing that the system is not great, and they actually put the spending limits back down a bit, and they think more carefully about how data gets used and abused, and that they do some things that are actually well-meaning for democracy rather than just in their own favor. And so I hope others on this call, but hopefully we will too, start putting some of those plans together so that people can see what a bit of a better future looks like.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think there's a couple more questions from Richard in the chat, but yeah, any final questions as we begin to start wrapping up the conversation? But sort of linked to that, we're talking about the two-party system, so maybe this is more of a systems question, but talking about the risks of AI to elections, etc., and obviously the electoral system and the voting system that we operate in. Question here: are there actors outside the official campaigns that are going to be much less restricted than the official campaigns? So people that can operate outside registered party, official campaign rules, but still have access to all this sort of AI technology, which, yeah, I mean, I could be a generative AI right now using, what's that app called, Heyo or something.
Yeah, I mean, look, so in 2019, the UK basically had American style political action committees for the first time, right? So the Tories, particularly, Tories supporting people spent 50 grand to 100 grand each running, side campaigns basically around the election. They were sort of called like campaign against Corbynism. There was one about right to rent or buy houses. There was a sort of pro landlord one. They were sort of a bit weird, but they ran and they spent money. And some of the things that we saw certainly in their ads was that they were reaching a lot of people, at that last minute. Now, nothing has changed in the rules to stop that happening, right? So if you still want to pop up an organization and spend money, and now you have a higher spending limit as well, you can do that. However, they don't start with a great deal of legitimacy, right? They start, they tended to pop up really close to the election. No one had heard of them before. When journalists tried to phone them up and find out who they were, they didn't answer calls. They didn't exactly look like very legit campaigning groups, and I'm pretty unpersuaded that they got good value out of their money in that case. But they're an interesting development. Something like it will probably happen again. But again, if I had a lot of money right now and I wanted to disrupt the British political process, in 2019 it made sense to try and support Richard, those sorts of people, right? Try and support organizations that are going to make Brexit happen and so on. You have to look at the circumstance in 2024 and try and work out who that would be. And I think that's much harder to kind of work out this time around.
So much, Sam. Does anyone else have any final sort of questions? There was I don't know whether this is really a quick question, but David, if you're there, just asking about AI's impact specifically on the STV elections in Northern Ireland. I don't know if you had anything to say on that, Sam, or maybe that's a conversation to take offline.
Yeah, I mean, again, only comment I'd make is that specific audiences, you have to think through what the potential impact of these things are on specific audiences, right? And Northern Ireland has, like my dad's from Belfast, I'm pretty well versed in like the things that happen and don't happen up there, and that's you could conceive of that sort of stuff happening. However, if you've ever looked at Northern Irish political campaigning, it's like a decade behind, at least the kind of online campaigning, it's like a decade plus behind. Like the parties there hardly do a thing. They hardly spend any money at all. It's a weird circumstance. It's a small country, not that many people in it, and so on. So I think just like running basic digital campaigns is beyond most Northern Irish political parties, let alone running sophisticated AI, driven, kind of community against community sort of stuff.
Thanks so much. So there's a quick poll. I don't know if has that popped up for people. Just a really quick poll. Like, do you believe that AI is less of a threat to the upcoming elections following this talk? Really interesting to gather everyone's opinion on that. But otherwise, Sam, thank you so much for that very reassuring, insightful, thoughtful, and well-rounded, just evaluation of AI's current threat / not a threat to the upcoming elections. And at the end that we can maybe catch up end of this year and see how right or wrong we were, if it's not too late, if the world is still somewhat coherent and we're able to have these calls in a peaceful society. But Sam, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for your attention and time this evening. It's been so great, and the conversation has been very, very fruitful. I'll reshare all the links in a summary, because I know sometimes it can be hard to follow, but please do join the community if you haven't already. The Democracy Network and Anti-Party's AI and Democracy groups. Join the WhatsApp, the Democracy Network check-in, to just kind of share your project with others in the ecosystem. And then there's this link to this forum to specifically continue the conversation from this evening, from today, there, following Sam's brilliant talk. So Sam, thank you so much. The polling so far, interesting. Well done, because you seem to have calmed most people's with a slight lead on yes, people believing that AI is less of a threat to the upcoming elections. So let's hope that faith is not misfounded or misplaced. And yeah, I hope everyone has, and we're right on time. Wow, this is okay. Great start to the sessions for the series this year. But thank you so much, everyone. So good to see you all, and stay tuned. See you at the next one. See you at the next webinar.